The second book of the Pentateuch is Exodus, which takes the nation of Israel from being slaves in Egypt, their escape across the Red Sea, and their encounters with God in the wilderness, including receiving the law. The sections we will highlight are the stage is set, the call and commissioning of Moses, the deliverance from Egypt, the journey to Mount Sinai, the covenant at Mount Sinai, instructions for the tabernacle, the incident with the golden calf, and finishing with the construction of the tabernacle. At the end of Genesis, Jacob's family had come to Egypt to escape the famine and were prospering there thanks to the legacy of Joseph. As Exodus begins, we learn that a new Pharaoh takes the throne who did not remember Joseph. Threatened by this growing people group within his borders, he makes the Israelites his slaves. The people are oppressed. To curb their growth and to minimize the threat, Pharaoh orders the Israelites to kill their male babies. One mother hides her son in a basket floating in the Nile River. When the baby is found by the daughter of Pharaoh, he is given the name Moses and is raised in the Pharaoh's house. As Moses grows, he becomes aware of the oppression of his people. One day he kills an Egyptian who was beating an Israelite and is forced to flee to Midian on the Sinai Peninsula. While there, Moses has his encounter with God at the burning bush. I Am tells Moses to go back to Egypt, to tell Pharaoh to let God's people go. He is given powers with his staff and convinces God to have his brother Aaron be his spokesman. When Moses comes to Pharaoh, instead of letting the people go, Pharaoh makes them make bricks without straw. The showdown has begun. Moses tells Pharaoh that there will be a series of plagues aimed at convincing Pharaoh to let the people go. At Moses' command, the water is turned to blood. There are frogs, gnats, flies, disease, boils, thunder and hail, locusts, and darkness coming to Egypt. But Pharaoh's heart is still hard. Moses warns of a final plague, the death of the firstborn of Egypt. The Israelites prepare the Passover feast and mark their doorposts with lamb's blood. The angel of death will pass over them. When all of Egypt is afflicted with the death of their firstborn children and animals, the Pharaoh relents and lets them go. They follow a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night as they go. When they reach the shores of the Red Sea, Moses raises his staff, and the sea parts so the Israelites can pass through on dry land. Pharaoh's army is pursuing them, but when God's people reach the other side, Moses lowers his staff, and the pursuing army is drowned. There is a big celebration led by Moses' sister Miriam. The liberated people now journey to Mount Sinai. Along the way, the complaining people are given manna, bread from heaven, that comes 6 days a week, and quail to eat. They get fresh water from a rock that Moses strikes with his staff. Moses is greeted by Jethro, his father-in-law. When the people reach Mount Sinai, they are consecrated, set apart for a holy purpose. They receive the 10 Commandments, which are carved into stone tablets. They receive many other laws about festivals, justice, and the blood covenant. To provide a special place for God's law, instructions are given for the tabernacle, an elaborate tent that serves as their temple while in the wilderness. First is the ark, a golden box made for carrying the stone tablets. They are also instructed to build a lampstand, the tabernacle itself, and the altar. Instructions are given for special clothing for the priests, ordination ceremonies, offerings, and laws for the Sabbath, the seventh day of rest. Moses spends considerable time on the mountain conversing with God. While he is away, the people get restless. They want a God they can see, so they ask Aaron to construct an idol in the shape of a calf made of their gold. When the golden calf is finished, they worship it. Moses descends from the mountain and is angry with the people's disobedience. He breaks the stone tablets against the golden calf and orders it destroyed. New stone tablets are made. During this time, people are aware of how shiny the face of Moses becomes after he has been with God. It is too shiny to look at, so they ask him to cover his face. He keeps his face covered, even after the shining fades. The book of Exodus ends with the actual construction of the tabernacle. When it is finished, the cloud that represents God's presence fills the tabernacle. The final three books of the Pentateuch, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, have less narrative than Genesis and Exodus. They are mostly compilations of laws and instructions about rites and celebrations. While they can be dry reading, it is important to look for ways that God is taking care of his people through these laws. Care of their health, their economic well-being, their religious life, the way they care for the poor and for foreigners are all woven into these laws. In Israel, the tribe of Levi was designated to be the priests. The book of Leviticus deals with all the laws pertaining to the priesthood. It covers the laws of the offerings in chapters 1 through 7, the laws of the priests in 8 through 10, laws of purity in 11 through 15, and the Day of Atonement, now known as Yom Kippur, in chapter 16. 17 through 20 covers holiness, 21 and 22, more laws about priests, then 23 to 25, appointed times and seasons, and finally, penalties and vows. Overall, Leviticus is concerned about keeping things holy, communicating to us just how set apart things for God needed to be in those times. Numbers is concerned about preparing to enter the promised land, then forfeiting the right to enter the land for the older generation. They would spend a total of 40 years wandering in the wilderness while that generation died off. There is more preparation for marching to the promised land, then more laws of the priests, appointed times, along with penalties and vows. Deuteronomy, literally the second law, is like a review of the law for a new generation. We are to remember the lessons of history, remember the 10 Commandments, remember the civil and religious laws of Israel in preparation for renewing the covenant with God. We learn about the final acts and the death of Moses. And then the Pentateuch ends with more appointed times and penalties and vows. A familiarity with the 5 books of the Pentateuch is important for understanding the Old Testament as a whole. The foundational stories are there. The early ways that God interacted with God's people is there. The concept of the law is there as well. But there's plenty of God's grace, God's salvation. The law is meant to be our response to the gracious acts of God in history. And the Exodus is the central event of the Old Testament. Again and again, God's people remind each other of the miracle of the liberation from Egypt. It is celebrated in the Passover every year. It is the subject of many of the Psalms. The prophets remind their listeners of God's salvation history, as seen in the Exodus. So now I hope you have a better understanding of the Pentateuch. If you have any follow-up questions or just want to talk about this or any other topic in our spiritual formation curriculum, contact me by email at markteagle@wesleysj.net. Thanks for listening.